If you run any sufficiently large organization, one of the biggest threats to your business is runaway costs. The largest companies can use upwards of thousands of suppliers for everything ranging from software technology to building materials. And how much you spend on all these suppliers can be the determining factor over whether you're profitable or unprofitable. That's why most large businesses employ procurement specialists, people whose job it is to oversee and negotiate services with outside companies. It's not the sexiest job in the world, but it's incredibly important, and it's the reason why the procurement services industry is worth $6 billion. Philip Ideson runs a media company that covers this massive industry. After spending 15 years as a procurement specialist himself, he launched the Art of Procurement, a news and information resource that caters to procurement specialists. Over the past 7 years, he's built it into a business that's monetized through live events, sponsorships, and consulting. In our interview, he talked about his motivation to launch the company, how he built his audience, and why he struggled so long to find a viable business model. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. Before we jump into the interview, you should take a moment to subscribe to my newsletter. It's jam-packed with media industry news and analysis, and it's a must-read if you want to expand your content business. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Philip. Hey, Philip, thanks for joining us.
No, it's my pleasure, Simon. I'm thankful for the invite.
So you run a media company slash publication called The Art of Procurement. Let's start with some definitions. I only really learned what procurement was a few years ago. What is procurement?
Yeah, so procurement is really the act of helping a business buy the things that it needs to operate. And so those can fit into two categories. It's buying the stuff that your business might need to create the products or the services that you go and sell. So in an automotive company, for example, buying all the parts that go into making the car, or it can be all the things that keep the business running. So that might be buying the contractors, buying healthcare, buying construction of new buildings, really any money that you're spending with an outside partner or supplier.
Yeah, and I learned that it's actually like a really complicated, really important part of running, especially a large business. Because you think like I as a solo operator, I subscribe to various SaaS products, including the product we're recording this on right now. But it's pretty easy for me to track my expenses. But if you have a company that has thousands of employees, you can imagine that not only are they individually subscribing to a lot of different products, some of which they're forgetting, like the person who subscribed to that product, they left the company years ago, and nobody even remembers how they used it. And also like different teams are using different products that do the same thing, and that could add up to a ton of money that eats into your operating expenses. So it's really important for teams, once they reach a certain size, to actually have procurement people whose job it is not only to keep track of all that stuff, but to negotiate good rates, to understand what the terms of service are, so that they're not like there's a liability type of thing to keep in mind. Like it's a super complicated thing, right?
Oh yeah, and beyond that, helping with innovation, so helping bring innovation from all your suppliers into a company when you're doing research and development. And for most companies, for most non-manufacturing companies, somewhere between, I'd say, 20 to 30% of their revenue goes out of the door on suppliers. So for every $1 billion in revenue, you're talking $200-300 million at least of spend with suppliers. For manufacturers, that can be 70% plus. So has a huge impact on the profitability of a company. How you manage that spend.
And a lot of procurement people, are they lawyers? Like they're really good at contracts and stuff like that, right?
It's funny, so I do a podcast as well in the procurement space, and the first question I always ask is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you? Meaning, how did you find yourself in the profession? 99% of us fell into it. We had no idea what procurement was when we got our first procurement job, and kind of went from there. So there's not a traditional path that finds yourself in procurement. There is a lot, like the role of a procurement person can vary wildly, but there is negotiations, there is making sure you're maintaining continuity of supply. So there's a lot of risk, especially over the pandemic when supply chain issues have been so prevalent. There is managing contracts, there is managing relationships. So you're really doing a whole lot of different elements in terms of how do you manage your suppliers. And there are lawyers for sure who got into contract law, who became into procurement, but most procurement people aren't lawyers, but they learn to find their way around a contract.
And before launching Art of Procurement, you spent years working in procurement, and eventually you ended up at Accenture, which is a large like consulting company.
Yeah, so I did. I've probably been 20 years plus now in procurement. When I started out of procurement, yeah, I did. There's really two sides. We talk about the practitioner side, which the practitioner side is I worked in companies helping them buy stuff. Whether that was in automotive. So I started with Ford Motor Company. I did that in pharmaceutical with Pfizer, consumer products with Chiquita, just a variety. I did financial services too, so I worked in a lot of different industries. Then I went on to the other side, which is more the advisory, the consulting, helping companies transform procurement, end up with a company that got bought by Accenture. So yeah, stuck with Accenture for a couple of years, but always had the entrepreneurial itch to go and try something different, and a passion to help folks kind of think differently about the role of procurement and what they could achieve, through a procurement career.
And so, when did you quit Accenture?
I quit in 2015. So I've been doing this for 8 years now.
And so, what was the? So, did you quit with an idea in mind, or did you quit just and decided you were going to figure out something? Like,
Yeah,
what was that transition like?
that's a great question. So I quit thinking that I was going to have a consulting business, and that the consulting business was all going to be around helping businesses figure out the optimum kind of structure for their procurement teams. And when I did, like, because I was always fairly risk averse, so I was worried about quitting my job. Probably as good a job as I ever thought that I would be able to get. When I started my career, to quit that to go and do something on my own. And I figured that I probably needed some kind of marketing channel. I was a bit of an introvert, so I was never, comfortable sitting or standing in front of a stage. And I'd been inspired by listening to a ton of podcasts on let's just go and do this. So I looked around and thought, you know what, there's not really that many procurement podcasts, so let's start a podcast as well. But that was always going to be just a nice to have to support the consulting business that I thought that I was going to be building. So that's where we started.
So, it was originally just purely a marketing channel, not that you were
Yeah,
looking to start a media company. So, you start
yeah,
something called the podcast is called the Art of Procurement, right?
yeah. Yeah,
And what
so the
was
business itself was so it was just like procure change, but then it was the podcast was the art of procurement. Ultimately, we ended up, adopting the podcast name as the company name as the podcast became more popular.
Yeah, it's probably something I should do at some point because like this podcast that you're listening to now is the business of content, but my newsletter
Mhm.
is called Simon Owens's Media Newsletter.
Yeah,
It's something on my to do list at some point to kind of create some kind of consistent brand name, especially if I ever want to expand or sell it in the future. But you start this podcast. The model is that you're just interviewing procurement specialists, right?
yeah. I thought, I used it as a channel to get to know people that ordinarily may not, give me the time of day. So if I give them a platform, people that I looked up to and I wanted to learn from, then they're more likely to pick up the phone, and maybe it would be a good way of meeting executives in the space that I wanted to sell to. And along the way, maybe I'll get a little bit of an audience of people. But that wasn't at the forefront of my mind. Really, was I got to build this big podcast that's going to have lots of listeners. It was more I want to learn from people, and I have an excuse now to invite them to a conversation.
So what happened? You launched in 2015. What
Yeah.
happened then that changed your thinking about the direction of the company
Mhm.
the business you were trying to build?
Well, to be honest, it took me a few years to figure out, am I a consulting business or am I a media business? And that was a really difficult period of time, in terms of a revenue perspective. Because if I didn't know what I was, then it was hard to project, to anybody else that they should know what I was. But I just saw listenership increasing, and I thought that maybe I'm onto something here. I was getting a lot of great feedback. I was having big companies approach me wanting to be on the pod and starting to want to talk to my audience. And it was just one of those things that I saw it as kind of a brand building exercise, like show up every week, hopefully more people find it. Hopefully I put good stuff out into the world, and hopefully at some point I'll be able to connect all the dots to figure out a way to monetize this. But as I was doing it for those first few years, really, I didn't necessarily have a monetization strategy in place for it. It was just about being consistent, showing up, getting a good reputation, and hopefully that will open some doors, down the line for me.
So you're kind of torn between a consulting business and a media business. Eventually, you start
Mm-hmm.
leaning towards the media side. So what happened after you kind of decided I'm going to pursue the media route?
Yeah, so it was at one of those moments where, I kept sailing past all of the checkpoints that I put in my place for, if I don't make this amount of money by this amount of time, it's time to get a real job. Back to, go back into the corporate world. But I was so passionate about what I wanted to do and I felt I had something. I kept sailing past all of those points, to the point where, I sold our house, we moved across the country, I emptied our 401k, I basically put everything that we possibly had into it, where there was nothing really much to put into it at that point. And the decision was honestly as simple as, okay, I think that it's going to be easier to monetize by selling to sales and marketing folks than it is to selling to procurement practitioner companies. That's probably my fastest way to cash.
Well, were you just having a hard time generating clients from what you were doing? Was that the problem, or you just weren't finding that very fulfilling to do the client stuff?
Yeah, I wasn't really finding clients, probably because I wasn't clear on what I was. I was experimenting with things like doing a paid community, with doing training, and I'd get the occasional inbound, and I'd get some consulting, some personal consulting that would come inbound, or that I'd be able to at least use the podcast to talk about, hey, this is, I'm somebody who knows, it's like an extended job interview, right? Anyone who goes and listens to your body of work. But I was struggling to get work from it. And yeah, the money was running out. So I tried to monetize what we were doing by selling to procurement people. And as procurement people, we're all, a little bit careful with our money. That's why we're in procurement. Um, and so that's a longer game. And I thought, like I say, that maybe selling to sales and marketing folks who are interested in telling stories that help, procurement folks make decisions in their life and in their jobs, maybe that'll be a faster path to cash. So we
How how
pivoted and
long
went that way.
how long were you out in the wilderness before you started to settle on something that had more promise?
Yeah, I would say it was 5 years, like 4.5 to 5 years of just showing up every week, getting more depressed about how much money was left in the bank account. There's a lot of lows, that it would have been certainly far easier to give up. But you go past this point where you think, how am I ever going to make back the money that I've invested into? And I know it's sunk cost and everything, but how am I going to make back this money that I put into this endeavor by having a regular job? And I'm not. So if I really need to just keep on going and keep on going and seeing if I can figure it out along the way. And so that was the approach I took for a good, you know, 18 months or so, before things really started to turn around.
Yeah, sometimes you hear the sunk cost fallacy cited a lot, but I think there are some things it doesn't apply to. I think there is when you're running a business, you're in this kind of trough where it doesn't look like you have a way out, but you're just
Mm-hmm.
thinking, well, I've been doing this for this long, I must be building up some goodwill. There must be some kind of something I'm building to, even if I don't know that I'm building it to it yet. So I should just keep on going, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I knew that we were building a really good brand. And I think one that tells me why I kept going was because I had a lot of people who were really my target persona on the outside, who would say from looking outside in, they would be talking about what a success it was and how great that we've grown it to this point, and all the things we're talking about, and can't do without listening to the show or the other content. So I knew that we were creating a lot of value from all the only measure I cared about was how much money was left in my account. But from a brand perspective and a reputation perspective, I knew we were really building something. And so I didn't really want to let that go. So I was telling myself that what I'm really doing is I'm investing in brand. I'm really investing in reputation. And it's really just a matter of figuring out how I can then use that, to try and start connecting these dots so I can monetize it.
So you said the revelation was that you needed to stop selling to procurement departments and start selling to sales and marketing departments. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it was. So when I talk about selling to sales and marketing departments, what I mean is, within the procurement space, there's a lot of technology providers, like there is in any space, that are serving the procurement departments themselves. They're not serving the rest of the business, and so those companies, want to get in front of procurement leaders to talk about, and other consulting firms want to get in front of those procurement leaders to talk about what they do, or really to educate the market on how they can help, and the whole B2B content machine. They need to feed
Like
this content machine.
like an Accenture or something, like companies that consulted
Yeah,
on procurement?
yeah. So I'd say that it's mostly like most of the folks that we work with are those that are kind of the mid level. So it might not be an Accenture. I mean, we have clients of almost that size, but it's mostly, very specific procurement. They support the procurement vertical more than they support anything else. So it's not the top of the biggest firms, but it's those mid-level firms that need to get in front of procurement to sell procurement consultancy, to sell procurement software.
Yeah. So you realize that the procurement departments who weren't your target audience, it was the people who want to reach the procurement departments,
Yes,
right?
which is something
So
I always try to avoid. Early on, I really was determined that I was going to make this a business that was funded by procurement departments as opposed to providers to procurement. But the reality is that the opportunity was on the other side in working with and doing it in a responsible way from a content perspective, so that it doesn't, from an audience perspective, it's always still seen as what we do as being thought leadership and educational, because it is, not towing the line into hawking products on behalf of these companies, but that they have the budgets more readily available to pay for stuff than I was finding when I was trying to sell more of the consulting side, at least at that point in time in the business.
so once you reached that revelation, what happened next? Like how did that change your business fundamentally?
Yeah, so I started to be really deliberate about what programs can I put in place that help companies talk about what they do, again, in a really educational way, not in a product way, but how can I create products that help them get in front of procurement leaders, digital events, webinars, appearing on the podcast, white papers, lots of different kind of content creation. So we basically became a content creation agency and a distribution channel for those, but with a team, like our team and my business partner. We all have procurement practitioner experience. Like I've said, we worked in those departments, so we're able to bring a lot more experience-based content than over and above what a general agency could bring. So that's kind of where we started. So we put together what we called a brand partnership guide, which was the menu of all the different ways that companies could work with us. And we just started to work with companies that we knew well, really underpriced it. But we wanted to, price discovery is really hard, especially when you're starting with, I just need cash. But also we wanted to start getting experiences and advocates and case studies and things, so that other providers would start to say, hey, Art of Procurement does that. Maybe I want to work with them as well. So we started doing that probably towards the end of 2019.
So you're putting out regular content, just pure editorial content, but then you start working with partners and you're like, look, we have an audience, we have a brand, so we can work together with you to not just create content, but actually put it out on our channels, whether it's a live webinar that people are attending, live, or a podcast interview where we're interviewing you, but it'll still be educational and fit in line with the editorial content we're already creating. So at that point, you started, like you said, it wasn't just podcasts, you were doing webinars. I think you probably launched an official website around the Art of Procurement. I see you're doing blog posts and stuff like that.
Yeah, we had that right from the beginning, the website, but it was always editorial. Now, it's still vast majority editorial in the way that we create content. So we talk with all our partners about it being a co-creation model. So what we don't do is we don't sell, here's a space on a stage, or here's a white paper for you to talk about whatever you want. We have editorial control over everything that we do with the partners. We're guiding and coaching them on how they can create, or how we can help them create content. We ultimately create the content for them that is seen as being non-promotional and non-commercial, but that still loops back to, brand recognition for them, still does loop back to lead generation. But we have to approve and basically create anything that we put in front of our audience so that we're comfortable in terms of the quality of the output, and that it doesn't cross that line.
So if you were doing like a webinar with a
Mm-hmm.
client, like would they be like a panelist on the webinar, or would they be the person you're interviewing on the webinar? Like what's that dynamic
Yeah,
look
so
like?
it would be a webinar just with them. So we would write, they would give us an indication of kind of what they want to talk about, but we often have a session with them where we help them figure that out, what they want to talk about. Then we'll write the synopsis for the webinar. We'll write the questions because we do them all interview style rather than using any slides. And then we'll do the webinar with them, but it's us interviewing them, or interviewing, a member of their team or a couple of members of their team, or they may bring a client along for their client to talk about the journey that they've been on. But we kind of manage and own that process, if you will. Now they can get approval on the synopsis from a marketing perspective, but they don't get approval on the questions and things like that we ask.
And then once you set that webinar at like a time, do you then have some email list of procurement professionals that you're blasting it out to and getting them to, they have to RSVP to attend, I'm assuming? Yeah.
Yeah, so
And
it's
then
typical kind of pushing the marketing for the webinar, they them registering and then coming and showing up.
And then my guess is that after the webinar is over, you turn over the list of people, the contact information and stuff for the people who attended the webinar. What's like a good turnout for a webinar?
Yeah, I'd say at the moment it's around 40% is the conversion rate of registrants to attendees. From how many folks are actually registering, I mean, probably 150 to 250, somewhere in that range.
So you're getting, 60 or 70 people on a webinar live.
Yeah, between 60 to, let's say, 120, 150, just depending on the number of folks who have registered.
And then are you repurposing the recording of that webinar at all?
Yeah, so the clients can have add-ons where we help them repurpose that material. So repurposing it into blog posts, or repurposing it into small videos and snippets. Repurposing it into a white paper is something that we do. Obviously repurposing it into a podcast recording because we do it interview style. So there are all those different options. We limit the number of times that we have certain repurposing because we don't want to put in our podcast feed, we don't want everything to be repurposed webinars, for example. But we have a certain number of slots where we'll repurpose webinars into the podcast feed as well. So, but we look at the webinar as the start of the journey for the content. The webinar is a content creation exercise that also happens to have people showing up and watching and engaging in, as opposed to the webinar being the end of the journey.
And someone listening to this might be like, 150 people, that's not many people to add. Why would you sponsor something that's only 150 people? But they get the email address, their salesperson can follow up with them. They've had a touch point, so it's probably a warm kind of introduction. And if just one of those people convert into a customer, that's potentially a 6-figure or even 7-figure payout for the company, right? So
Yeah,
they're willing.
these are big deals that they will be selling. And so, yeah, typically because just the sales cycle of the sales cycle of selling to procurement folks is that cycle might be a 9 or a 12-month cycle. And so touch points are really important along the way to keep them warm. And of course, there may be the lead that comes up and decides that's their decision point in going and buying. But yeah, the deals that they might buy, multi-year as well, typically. So it might be a 6-figure a year deal, but goes over multiple years. So they're really valuable deals.
And that client might send an email to one of the people right afterwards and be like, "Thanks for joining us on that webinar." So they know it's not like a cold sales email. It's like, it's a touch point after that, and maybe that makes them a little bit more likely to answer that email or respond or whatever. Yeah. So you start building out white papers, new webinars, podcasts. Like, how do you, in terms of like becoming more in a media business, like obviously people were subscribed to their podcast feed, but what are other ways that you're building like a direct relationship with the audience?
Yeah, so our biggest the biggest driver of audience for us is our email list. We've been always from the very beginning wanting to make sure that we have that we're capturing as many of those emails as we can from our community members, so we can communicate directly with them, but also through LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the other primary channel. We have a lot of LinkedIn followers to the business page. We have, individually to all of our team members. My business partner actually has been involved in a couple of the LinkedIn creator programs over the last couple of years. So one of the podcasts that we create right now is actually a LinkedIn sponsored. Well, it's LinkedIn Presents, which is part of the LinkedIn Podcast Academy. So that's been a really good channel for us to get to know folks as well. Although using LinkedIn changes all the time. So we have to kind of work our way around that. But email list and LinkedIn are the primary channels. We haven't done any paid ads yet. So that's something that we're starting to think about now as a potential channel as well.
And I was looking at the site, and it looks like you have like blog posts that are very kind of SEO optimized. Like you could, like people who are looking to do research, maybe doing some early Googling on different procurement things. Is that becoming like a bigger part of your funnel? Is like people coming in through Google?
It's funny. We're in the very early stages of that. So I would say the first few years, we didn't pay any attention whatsoever to SEO. We just built up this body of work. And so now, as one of our channels, we're starting to look and relook at all the content we've got, because we've got so much content. And how do we start to think about optimizing that from an SEO perspective? So that's in kind of probably the first inning of seeing that as being a channel, because ultimately that's what we want to do. We want to rank higher, bring folks in through search engines and direct traffic, and then convert them to the email list.
Mm-hmm. What about like just standard sponsorships, like just podcast sponsorships, branding, stuff like that? Is that a big part of your business, or is it more these kind of lower funnel type of things?
Yeah, we haven't really done pure. I tried and experimented with that in the very early days, but for us, we want to be in control of the content that we're putting in front of our audience. We think that's a big part of our kind of brand and reputation, and also that demonstrates that we're not just kind of selling anything. And so we don't really do pure sponsorship. It's all related to content that we've created or co-created. So we'll talk in certain podcasts about content that we've created with a partner, but we won't just sell a sponsorship. Really, because from when you think about it from a traditional payment, monetization of traditional sponsorship and being on CPMs, we just don't have the volume of traffic that would make that anything more than making $5 or $10 here and there. The value is really, how do we help folks get in front of their target audience through the content that we help create and then distribute.
And so you spent 5 years out in the wilderness trying to figure out a product market fit. How did you, once you started actually generating revenue, I know that you did start hiring. What kind of roles did you start hiring for?
Yeah, so there's two of us. There was two of us in the business, my partner and I. So my business partner is very much focused on the writing side. That's where her area of expertise is. So there was two of us in the business before we started hiring. The first hire was really on somebody who could help us do a lot of the stuff that was really time consuming for us. That is, like setting up landing pages, doing the podcast editing, helping us with communications related to sponsorships with our clients, helping to do some of the organization for digital events. Someone who is kind of a generalist across a number of different areas, but that can take a lot of those task-based work off our plate, so that we could start focusing. You work so many hours that we're still focusing on things like that, but we're not as heavily focusing on those kind of more tactical roles. So that was really our goal for our first hire.
And then do you have like a salesperson? Are you doing cold sales, or is it all inbound?
So I now have a member on the team that's helping me with sales. So that's somebody we've known for a long time, who is also a former chief procurement officer, so knows the space really well as well. I was doing all the sales myself until really the beginning of this year. So through this year, my team member Helen has been really helping me go more outbound. Like it's always been inbound because I was really bandwidth restricted as well. So it's inbound and it's renewals is really how we would continue to build the business. But now we've got more bandwidth within the business. We do a lot more outbound, and we're bringing folks in, and that's proven to be pretty successful so far. And then as we go into next year, then I'll hand off more of that responsibility. So I'm still involved in solutioning, where we have partners who are wanting kind of complex packages, but I'm not involved necessarily in the day to day of the sales side. And that was a big thing for me because when I started and when I was really struggling, I felt that I don't know how to sell. And it's funny what selling does to your confidence. As you start to sell things, then you get more confident you can sell. And all of a sudden, it all kind of makes sense. And that's probably what happened over the last year or two.
So far you seem to have mainly focused on like kind of more evergreen education type content. Have you, in thinking kind of going forward, have you thought about getting into more newsy content around the procurement space, whether it's just like a daily or weekly newsletter, or what are your kind of thoughts on like actually covering the procurement like world?
So we have done that on and off, but not in a consistent manner. It's something that's always in my mind of doing. So, an early driver of our newsletter back in, probably 2016 to 2018 timeframe was doing curated newsletters. So, curating the content, sending it out every week, called it This Week in Procurement. So we still do some of that, but it's more observing what other people are writing and giving our own slant on that. We do have 2 weekly newsletters that we send out every week, but we've not actually been doing coverage of the industry. And I think mostly that's because we just need to focus. Where do we focus our time and our bandwidth, as opposed to that necessarily not being a good idea. We've just wanted to really focus on building up a cash position in the business where we feel like we have the ability to then go and invest in new and interesting things. And as we grow, as we get bigger, what's really interesting to me, a space like this, when I started, I thought there's a glass ceiling on how much money I think we can earn doing this. So we always kept the consulting business going. And we do still, today, probably 30% of our revenue is still consulting. But as we do more and we work more closely with partners and we grow, that ceiling that I saw keeps on growing and growing and growing because I see new opportunities. So that's being really fruitful for us.
Do you think there's a future for you in memberships and subscriptions, or do you think it's some B2B publishers I talk to? They're just like, no, the cost benefit isn't that great. I'd rather just stay completely free because I can make so much more money from a marketing and advertising perspective. Do you think that there's something there with memberships?
Yes. Yeah, I think there is something with memberships both for the people trying to sell to procurement and which is one persona, but also for the procurement departments themselves. So that's something that's absolutely on the roadmap. The way that I want to spread our risk profile as a business to have where it's not all contingent upon what's people's advertising and sales and marketing budget's going to look like next year. So that's part of it for me. And how do I continue to pursue different personas? But it's all part of a flywheel for me. Content, subscription, membership based, which is one-to-many help, and then consulting and advisory, which is more the one-to-one help. And then that can all flow back into the content.
Do you think the subscription product would involve locking content behind a paywall, or is there some other benefit that you could offer?
I think that I never want to change. It's big for us on being able to provide as much free resources and content and educational material as we possibly can to the community. So when I think about membership sites, it's either additional content rather than just taking content that we've already got and putting it behind a paywall, or other value adders like tools, templates, things like that are helping people do their jobs, bringing people together. Events, in-person events, that's something that we're getting into as kind of a next growth opportunity.
Yeah, so that was my next question.
Yeah.
So what's the in-person events strategy?
So we are, I've always waited because I wanted to make sure that when we test in-person events, that it's not just throwing money down a black hole. because I know events can be expensive, especially when you start looking at some of the bigger events. So we actually have a pilot event that we're doing in November in London, which is around a very specific vertical. It's around the pharmaceutical business, which is one of our largest industry verticals of people in our community. That was opportunistic to test what demand there is from an in-person event perspective, but we're planning for 2024 to do a series of regional events across the US. So our strategy is definitely smaller, local, regional than it is, two big events a year or one big event a year. And so that allows us to be a little bit more, it takes away some of the financial risk of doing the first ones. But I just believe that there's a gap in the market for that as well.
So when you look ahead like 5 years from now, where do you want to be? Like where do you want to be expanding into, whether it's verticals or business models or hiring more writers or podcasters or content creators? Like where do you kind of envision the business going?
That's a great question. I try not to set too long-term plans so that we can be as adaptive as possible. But ultimately, our business still has two elements to it: a media business and a consulting business. We're building out our consulting business now that we have the cash flow that's supporting the business to be able to do that. That's more on a advisory and like buying consulting and advisory as a subscription, because I'm wanting to get into as many recurring revenue kind of membership subscription products as I can from a cash flow, but also a revenue and an operating model. So it's less project based. So I see us with a thriving consulting and advisory business, which is based on, a membership model. I see us building out our membership and training and development programs that support both the provider side, so those who are selling to procurement, but also the practitioner side, so those who are in the procurement departments themselves. And then from a media side, I think that I see the growth opportunities in a lot more niche content. There's a lot of generic content out there in the world. There's a lot less niche content. And as our audience grows, we have more people in the niches. So we can do some stuff that's much more targeted and specific for them. So that's definitely an area to focus. Building out our in-person program, for sure, is another one of those. And then you start looking at, okay, what are some adjacent industries to procurement? Where that supply chain is an example. So those are definitely some of the opportunities I see.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of B2B companies go that route. Like I just wrote about Aging Media, for instance, which launched like a bunch of B2B verticals around, aging, the whole industries having to do with aging and stuff like that. So that's interesting to think about that in terms of like niching down within procurement. So you're thinking of like launching podcasts or something about a very specific sub niche within procurement.
Yeah. So whether it's newsletters, whether it's specific webinars for that audience, think about a chief procurement officer that works in the manufacturing business supporting automotive. There is very little out there for that specific persona right now. And so they're not necessarily getting the content they need that's very targeted towards them. And so you multiply that across all industries, different geographies, there's a whole load of opportunity to be a lot more kind of hyper targeted within the content. So I see that as an opportunity because then from an email list perspective and a segmentation, it allows us to market what we're doing at very specific segments, allows you to increase production and the number of things that you're doing as well.
And when you're saying recurring revenue with the consulting side, it's like trying to create some kind of formalized service, like a monthly phone call or something like that, or like it's hard to turn a service into a product that you monetize in a recurring way.
Yeah, so we have a business that we are launching that the website is already out there called Spend Pros. And so the concept of that is that, as you buy something, you go through a formal process. You go from, hey, I think I need to buy this. What are the things I should be aware of? All the way through to which supplier should I use, sending a request for proposal, negotiating, contracting, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those is like a really discrete step in the process of buying something. Now you can separate those into specific processes and therefore mini kind of productized service engagements. We call them briefings, and sell those briefings. So those briefings have fixed inputs. So same questions you ask of every client. And then you have an expert who knows how to buy payroll services because that's all they do. As an example, you can multiply that across anything that a company buys. But the expert who knows how to buy that one thing can then basically give recommendations on this is the strategy, this is the tactics, this is the suppliers you should go to, all those things. Traditionally, companies have really only been able to access those when they buy a contractor or they sign a big consulting deal with Accenture or whatever it may be. But by building those into these small briefings, you productizing it, and then you can sell those briefings as a subscription. So that's really kind of the goal of how we do that.
Do you worry about any conflicts in terms of you having consulting business, but then also selling marketing channels to consulting businesses?
So I think the persona is so on one side, yes, of course, that's been one of the reasons why we've not pushed on the consulting side as much as aggressively. Like consulting is 100% inbound at the moment, but on the other hand, where the partners that we work with who are selling consulting services are selling big deals. They're selling to somebody who is in the market to spend 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, whatever that may be a year in consulting services. Whereas the model that we have is selling to those that can't really afford the big ticket consulting prices, or their model is such where it just doesn't make sense for them to make that big investment on something where they just need some micro help. So there isn't really a lot of competition between, and we've deliberately, as we try and think about how we scope the consulting support we do, not a lot of competition between those that we're working with from a marketing perspective and those that we've been working from a delivery. The other thing is the way we deliver using members of the network, the ecosystem. So we don't have consultants ourselves on house. We actually have a pre-vetted network of experts who are, some of which are working in companies that we work with on the sales side. So we actually have a relationship on both sides of the houses with those people.
Cool. Okay, Philip, well, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. So artofprocurement.com, if there's anyone that's listening who happens to be in the procurement space or is just interested in the conversation, that's the website. And of course, personally, it's really easy for anyone to find me on LinkedIn. I'm really active on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
All right. Thanks, Simon.